Good morning, students. Thanks for joining me for another lecture for the big picture of Scripture. Today we're on lecture 17, and we're going to do kind of a flyby from Genesis 22 to the end of Genesis 50. So I'm going to open us in prayer and then jump into it. Lord, I thank you for this day, and I pray that you'd bless the students that are watching this lecture. I pray that you'd help them to gain something from it. It's kind of a tricky lecture for me to teach, so I pray that you'd help me and in doing it and help me to be able to communicate something that will be helpful, Lord. And I pray that you continue to bless us as we study the covenants, as we study the big picture of Scripture, the trajectory of Scripture. And I thank you for giving us your word, Lord. And I pray that you'd help us to be able to learn it and grow and be able to apply it to our lives, Lord, so that we can apply it for good thinking, for rebuke, for teaching, for correction, for understanding, to share your word for people that don't know you, Lord. And I pray that as we study your word, God, that you be empowering us and leading us and guiding us. In Jesus' name I pray. I'll go ahead and share the screen and we'll get at it. So what I'm going to try to accomplish today is kind of from Abraham to Moses. I'm going to try to give a flyby. This is a lot of chapters. I would never normally teach a lesson on this many chapters of Scripture. Ultimately, in this class, we're trying to cover the trajectory of Scripture from creation all the way through to new creation. And in doing so, we're going to not be able to cover everything. Certainly, it's meant to be a survey. It's meant to help guide us through by looking at the covenants to kind of use those as benchmarks to guide us through. And that's what we're going to be able to focus on in the class. But what I want to kind of do is just talk about the covenants briefly here. You know, we're looking at these covenants in particular. We're looking at the covenants that are explicitly listed in Scripture in some way. We've mentioned before that the Adamic covenant and the Noahic covenant are less explicit in terms of their description. Obviously, there is a description of a covenant with Noah, but we're kind of going to cover these as the covenants of creation. And then we have the Abrahamic covenant, which we're studying now. We're going to get to the Mosaic and the Davidic covenant, and then the New covenant. And there's some distinctions in the ways that people describe these covenants and name them. There's some nuances, even if some people might include an additional covenant. For example, they might call an everlasting covenant after the new covenant, but we see God's word calls the new covenant an everlasting covenant as well. So it's a little tricky to kind of get into some of the dissection or demarcation of these covenants. But these are the main covenants that we're looking at as part of this course. And really the ones that are more explicitly listed in Scripture. So I'm not going to try to reconcile that again. But what we've looked at so far, I kind of just want to take a second to review. And I'm actually using, to help me, I'm going to use this little pamphlet that I have to guide me through. It kind of lists a lot of the main chronological elements of the Bible. It's a pretty cool pamphlet. It's called the Chronology of the Bible. Timeline and Bible Reading Plan. It's produced by Rose Publishing. I hope they're a good company. But as I look at it here, it's interesting because it walks us through the Bible and it gives us a chronological listing of some of the major events in the Bible. And it also allows us to kind of see how the covenants map across those, how time does. So there's a timeline from 2100 plus BC all the way until AD 100 here. And then you can see also in this, there's quite a few different benchmarks listed here, as well as where you find them in the Bible. So it's a really kind of a cool reference. And I'm actually using this to kind of guide me through a lot of this discussion today. So some of the content I've taken from there. But just to kind of cover what we've looked at so far, we see that, you know, we started with the beginning of the Bible and the story of creation, which we know was before 2100 BC. You know, how much before is hard to say. We look at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the Adamic covenant. Then we saw that there was the fall. We see that Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. Cain killed Abel. And then we saw Noah's Ark and the flood and kind of a a new start for humanity. And again, we see then that Noah failed as did the first Adam, and he was no more able than Adam to bring about reconciliation with God. Then we saw the Tower of Babel, and then now we've been looking at the Abrahamic covenant. And in about 2091 BC, Abraham goes to the land of Canaan. Ishmael was born, and then we saw that Ishmael wasn't the son from which the promises were going to be made or fulfilled, but it was instead Isaac. And then what I'm trying to do is just give us a flyby of what we've looked at so far and what we're going to be seeing coming up. Isaac was then born to Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away. And then where we've kind of left off was that Abraham was tested by God to sacrifice Isaac, and instead, obviously, God spared Isaac, and Abraham sacrificed a ram instead that God provided. And what we're going to see what we're not going to see here is this next part, what I kind of want to cover. We're going to pick this story back up in Exodus with the Passover and with the Mosaic covenant. And so what I want to kind of touch on in this lecture is just really a flyby. I'm only going to kind of list through some of the main things that we're not going to cover in the course. And so that's kind of the goal here. What happens after Abraham is tested and is prepared to sacrifice Isaac, only to see Isaac spared, is that then his wife Sarah dies, and Isaac marries Rebekah in Genesis 24. And between Isaac and Rebekah, they have Esau and Jacob. Their two sons are Esau and Jacob. Esau's the firstborn and has the birthright, but ultimately what ends up happening is, well, first Abraham dies after Esau and Jacob are born, and then and again, remember, Esau and Jacob are the sons of Isaac. Jacob deceives Isaac and is given the blessing of the firstborn in Genesis 27. So again, God doesn't choose the oldest, the one who's likely to be receiving the promises and the blessings of the firstborn and inheritance of the firstborn. Instead, God chooses Jacob. Jacob ends up marrying Leah and Rachel. He sets off to marry Rachel, and there's kind of a confusing situation that happens where he ends up marrying Leah, and then ultimately works again for his father-in-law and ends up marrying Rachel. And this is an important thing here because Jacob ends up having 12 sons, and his sons are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And this is important because these are the 12 sons of Jacob. And then Jacob's name is changed to Israel. If you remember, God promised Abraham that he would have mighty nations would come from his descendants. He promised him that he would have land, and he promised him blessings. And so, and he promised him some specific things related to the blessings, that he would bless those who blessed him, and he would curse those who were against him, his enemies, and that also that the world would be blessed through him. And we see that God is focusing his work in humanity through this one family of Abraham. And now Abraham's grandson, Jacob, we see is the grandson from whom these blessings are gonna pour. We're seeing more getting narrowed in more specifically. And what we're seeing is with Jacob, God changes his name to Israel. And so Jacob is Israel. Jacob is the name of the man whose name is now changed to Israel. Israel is the nation. You know, you have to realize this is a family nation. This is a tribe of people. The tribe is Israel. And Israel becomes a nation. And we call the 12 tribes of Israel these different names right here, right? And they're named after these sons. So to be a tribe is in one sense to be a family. It's to be the son of Jacob, to be the son of Israel. And to be the son of Israel These are the names of the sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And then what it means to be a tribe is to be a family, right? So if my family is the Lind family, I have 3 siblings. My dad's name is Pete. To be a tribe of Pete would be to be, a son of Brad, or to be a son of Brian or Matt or my sister Jody. That would be our tribes, right? In a sense, right? But these become a nation, and the nation ends up obtaining a territory and land. And in that land, it's divided into smaller territories. And those territories are named after these sons. And it's their families that take possession of these lands eventually. We're not at that point yet, but Jacob has 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And those sons are allotted land. Their families are allotted land. Hundreds of years later, when they take over Israel, they end up settling Israel by tribe. And Reuben had lost his birthright, but he's also still given an allotment of land. Simeon, Levi, these become the tribes of Israel. And we don't see any land allotment for Levi, so that's not ultimately one of the 12 tribes when it comes to the territories of Israel. It's a tribe, but it's not one of the territories. And we see Joseph is given a double portion. So we don't see the term Joseph when we look at the tribes or at the land. We instead see Ephraim and Manasseh. These are grandsons of Jacob, because Joseph gets a double portion, and his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are then given their own allotment of land, and Benjamin. So it's a little bit confusing. We see Levi doesn't get an allotment, which would bring the 12 down to 11, but we see Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, each getting an allotment. And so instead of calling it, the land of Joseph, it's Ephraim and then Manasseh. And so we see the 12 territories of Israel corresponding with the 12 tribes, with a couple subtle adjustments. Levi ultimately isn't given any land allotment, because the tribe of Levi is set aside to be priests across the entire territory. So I'm not really trying to get too much into that right now, but we're going to cover that when we get into the Mosaic Covenant and beyond. Frankly, we're going to get into that beyond. But ultimately, I just want to point out here that it's Abraham's son Isaac to whom the promise is continued, and then it's Isaac's son Jacob to whom the promise is continued, the covenant is renewed. And it's Jacob who becomes Israel. His name becomes Israel, and it's his family that is known as the Israelites. It's his family that God chooses ultimately to narrow in on, from which we're going to end up seeing the promises fulfilled. In fact, if you notice here, you're going to see an important couple names. One is Judah. We know that Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah. Oops, sorry about that. Let me find my spot again here. Where did I go? Okay. We know that Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, right? We know that the priests come from Levi, the tribe of Levi, the Levitical priests. And so we're going to see that some of these tribes have significance that we're going to see later. In fact, all of them do. But we're also going to see another important person comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Who comes from Benjamin? Well, that's Saul, the first king of Israel. It's also the Apostle Paul. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. So the 12 sons of Reuben are listed here, and these ultimately this is what is the tribes of Israel. And ultimately, we kind of see a little distinction here if you follow some of the history of it and how they're described. Jacob and Esau end up reconciling, and then Rachel dies. Then Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. So that's a very important part as well. When we see that Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and remember here, we're talking about Jacob's son Joseph, right? He's favored among his brothers in Jacob's eyes, and they end up selling him into slavery. And what happens after that is ultimately Isaac ends up dying. Judah and Tamar have a son. Joseph's thrown into prison. Joseph's made an official in Egypt. and then his brothers and him reconcile. And from there, Joseph's family ends up migrating to Egypt in around 1876 BC. Now, I'm not trying to get too firm on these dates. I'm not even positive how accurate these dates are and aren't. There's various different dates that are given a lot of different places. But around 1876 BC, Joseph's family migrates to Egypt because of the famine. And God kind of spared Israel through Joseph by sending him to Egypt, even though his brothers did an evil act in sending him to Egypt. We know that Joseph found favor in Egypt and gained a high position. And so God ended up sparing Israel because through the famine they sent, Israel ended up going back. Israel meaning the family, the whole entire family of Jacob ended up going to Egypt and found favor because of Joseph. And they ended up migrating to Egypt. And at first they were thriving and doing well, but eventually they thrived so much that the people of Israel were growing and succeeding and populating that there became fear, and Pharaoh ended up fearing Israel and ended up enslaving them. And so we're going to pick up the rest of this class in the Mosaic covenant, and at the beginning of that we're going to look at the plagues of Egypt and the Passover. But that's how we got to that place. We've just skipped 30 chapters almost in Genesis, and this is what we skipped. Genesis ends with Joseph and Israel in Egypt, and we're going to pick up in Exodus, realizing that they've been enslaved for many years, and we'll kind of go from there. But that's just a quick flyby. I know it's not a lot to really sink your teeth into. We've just barely touched on important topics, but ultimately this class requires us to continue to progress and study the covenants. And so we have some things that we have to skip, and nothing in the Bible is should be skipped, frankly. But in for the sake of the class, we don't have time to focus on everything. So I would definitely encourage you to consider reading these chapters 22 through 50, but you may not have time to do it at this point in time, and I understand that. But if you do, if you can, it'd be a wonderful exercise to continue to read through Genesis in anticipation of the next coming lectures and reading assignments. But again, if you can, I totally understand. And this was just a quick flyby to try to help us understand how did the nation of Israel start to get founded. This is before they've even really conquered the promised land or anything like that. And now we're seeing them in Egypt, and we're going to be in Egypt for a long time before they're going to be rescued from Egypt through Moses by God, and ultimately they're going to make a journey back to the promised land. So that's kind of how we got from point A to point B, and we're going to pick it up with the Mosaic Covenant and Exodus in the coming lectures. So thank you for your time, and thank you for continuing through this course.